My screen. So the way we're going to start this process is we will go through just a very quick overview in a PowerPoint presentation just to give a sense of the different pieces of the budgeting puzzle here. So for those who have been on Multiview for a while, you'll be familiar with kind of our traditional way that we have previously budgeted. Within Multiview, we have a couple of different tables, our GL budgets table and our GL actuals. Both of those tables feed into our viewpoint analytics cubes, which allow us, of course, to do reporting, basically to create our reports for our budget versus actual reports. The way we got information into there was either through kind of a manual data entry process. We used budget interfaces, so we had very rigid Excel templates, or we connected to third-party systems, which was already mentioned used, such as Adaptive. We've moved away from that process, and we're providing a little bit of a new process. And that new process enables us to take advantage of everything being fully integrated within Multiview. So we have as many prior years worth of actuals and budgets as you've loaded within Multiview to use in the budgeting process. And kind of the workhorse of these budgets is our workbooks themselves. They're used for data entry purposes, for calculations. We have very specific ones for payroll. We can do a bunch of allocations. The idea behind a workbook generally is we're going to start splitting up your chart of accounts into different sections. So as an example, we might have expenses broken out into payroll and non-payroll, or kind of operating, non-operating. Revenue we might break out. We'll have some supporting workbooks for things like statistics that we might use as key drivers for our budgets. All of those different workbooks come together to create this year's budget, next year's forecast, whatever it happens to be. We have a few different reports within the budget module itself that we can do kind of a spot check on to see where we are versus what we expected. Then ultimately we can post the budget, and then we can leverage off of those existing tools we have on the viewpoint analytics side. So one of the nice things about this is you can use the reports you've already built and just constantly post your budget. So as you're working through it, you post it, reopen it, immediately that information will be available to use in viewpoint analytics to get a little bit more professional looking report out of the system if you wanted to present the budget at that point. So that's really just kind of the overview of the different pieces. What I'm going to do now is actually flip into Multiview itself and go through it in quite a bit of detail. As Jonathan mentioned at the outset, if there are questions that come up as we're going through this, please feel free to ask. I'm sure you won't be the only one thinking of that question. So let me just switch screens here, and I'll take you into Multiview. So we've got 3 different screens on the go. Got to figure out which one's the one I want here. All right, this one. All right, so are you guys able to see Multiview? So this is our desktop view. If I get a yes from anyone that we can see it.
Yes.
Perfect, thank you very much. All right, so for those who have not used the desktops provide a quick way for you to get access to different areas within the product very quickly. And each panel here is called a widget. And the one we're going to focus on today will obviously be our budget widgets. But we can also set up one for all of the actions that you have. So this would be triggering things like workflow, assignments, are there alerts that you've created off of queries or reports, and obviously the budget approvals and contributions that you need to make. The quick access or the dashboards that we set up for quick access and dashboards. This is a quick way for us to see our different reports that we might want to run within the system. And then finally our budget. And what we're seeing here in our budget is all of the different versions that we have. And a version in budgeting is really representing either a different year. So it might be here's my 2016 budget, my 2017 budget, or it could be the revisions we make to that, the reforecasts, different scenarios that we might choose. Any individual budget is called a different version within Multiview. And if we flip down to the very bottom of this, what we'll see is the budget admin and then budget designer. Those are both, administrative tools within the budget. And those are controlled by security codes. So in order to access those, you need to have set up specific security codes and assign it to whatever users. The other screens, so for the workbooks, those assignments are usually for who is contributing data to a particular department, if it happens to be, or who is approving that. There's no specific security codes, but rather the security is controlled within the budget and forecasting module, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. So in addition, if you don't want to set this up, you of course can always use the menus that we have. So we have Multiview, Budgeting, and we have access to that same screen here. So within our budget admin, which we'll just open up here, this is showing all of those different versions that we just saw on that first screen. And this is where we're really going to go through and set up the shell of your budget. And the shell of the budget is going to contain what type of data and how much of that data do you actually want to have within your budget. So we're going to pick on our 2017 budget that we actually used at iMug this year to go through an example. So this will be exactly the same as if we were doing this for the first time, creating a new version. We're just showing you what's already been done. So through this edit version configuration, it's simply going to take us through a wizard. And that wizard is just going to help us choose what information you need within the budget. So here we're simply going through and selecting, what's the calendar year you're using for your budget, what periods are we budgeting for, and then what period am I budgeting from? And this, when we're setting up a brand new budget for the year, would always be for the first period. But let's say, for example, you're now reforecasting for the remainder of the year. We only want to reforecast for the last 6 months. Well, we could update this and we could say, you know what, I actually want to start budgeting from 1607. And that's going to lock down the first 6 periods so that no changes can be made. So it just provides a little bit of extra flexibility for controlling exactly what you want to be updating. Lastly, to go back to that, thinking about that PowerPoint that I started with, when we post the information from the budget, it transfers all of the data that we've collected within this budget and forecasting module to a specific budget ID. And this budget ID is what's going to be available within our Viewpoint Analytics cubes to report on. The next screen we go through here is simply saying, what dimensions do we need? What type of data do we want to include within our budget? So at a minimum, as you know, within Multiview, we need at least the unit and the account representing the departments or cost centers or locations and the GL account. But we can also get a lot more granular and budget down to the RAD level, so our related accounting data level. So since this is a hospital database, I'll stick with the hospital side. If we were talking about something like financial classes, that would be, what is revenue, Medicare, Medicaid, self-pay, insurance, whatever it happens to be, as an example. Another example might be if we were trying to budget travel expenses, we might want to be able to be a little bit more granular and say, you know what, these are this conference I'm attending, or this is prepaid travel, or this is whatever it happens to be. We can get a lot more granular without having to create additional accounts to record that level of granularity. So really, we can go through and select as many RADs as you need to create your budget. The next screen simply is saying for each one of those dimensions, we need to choose an ownership. So this is our hierarchy or our roll-up structure that we have. If, for example, you did have 2 different companies and they had significantly different ownerships, we could actually bring in more than one ownership here as well. For some clients that have been around for a while, and I know a few of the folks on the phone are long-term Multiview clients, what we often would do is go through your ownerships and see, do you currently have an ownership that works for budget purposes? Or does your ownership maybe include a lot of things that have changed over the years? So you have a section that's now holding units that are no longer active or accounts that are no longer active. We might suggest setting up a new ownership for those that removes all of that information. So we essentially have a new budget ownership. Oftentimes we can just make use of the regular ownerships we use for financial reporting purposes, but sometimes we do need to make some changes, and often it's easier just to create a new ownership for budget purposes. So for each dimension, we simply choose our appropriate ownership. The next screen, we're just choosing budget amount, so we can skip that. This screen is important in the sense that it's saying, what type of data now do we want to bring in? So the first line is saying, we're going to bring in our actuals. And on here, we're saying, how many years worth of history do you need to bring in for budget purposes? So as I mentioned in the outset, we can bring in as much history as has been loaded into Multiview. So if you have 5 years worth of data you want to bring in, no problem. If you want to bring in just the prior year, we can absolutely do that as well. The next piece is saying when we start our budget process, we're typically a portion of the way through the year. So we're budgeting for next year, but we're only 3 months, 6 months into the year. So we need to tell the system, how many months worth of data do I have? And then what, if anything, do I want to do for those remaining periods which have not yet occurred? So this is essentially projecting out our current year. So we've seen some clients just leave it where it's 6 months worth of actuals and then zero fill the remaining 6 months. We can replace it with the budget or forecast for that year. The popular option we've seen is just annualizing the current year. So we'll just average the current year. And the final option is looking back at the history. So if we've said included 3 years worth of history, we can get the system to look back and see those remaining 6 months in this case, how have they flowed over those prior 3 years? And it can average based on that as well. The second column is simply the budgets. So how many prior year budgets do we want to include in here? So those are our two options. We just choose the amount of data or the number of years worth of data we want for both of those data types. The system, based on those selections that we made, the system will go through and automatically create the way we're going to reference the information, and that's these variables. So the way to think about this is everything is relative to the year in which we're budgeting for. So in this example, we're budgeting for 2017. Let's go this way. We're budgeting for 2017. So we've called this our budget year. Since everything is relative to that, we're going to say 1 year ago would be 16, 2 years ago would be 15. It just makes it a little bit easier to visualize what we're looking at when we think of it as what year am I budgeting for and what are the offsets to that? Because that's how we're going to reference them in our columns itself. There's a number of different user types that we have within the system. We have the administrator, which is obviously what we're working through right now, but we also have the analysts. And an analyst is simply a read-only user that you want to be able to see all the data within the budget, but never make any changes. We can assign that either at this level, which would apply to all of the workbooks we create, or you can go through individually workbook by workbook and assign at that level. So as an example, if you had non-payroll expenses and payroll expenses broken into two different workbooks, maybe you'd want to give somebody access to just the non-payroll expenses and maybe lock down further payroll so nobody could see that. So we can do it at kind of a global level here or at a very granular level, workbook by workbook. And the final option, so those who are familiar with Viewpoint Analytics, the cube concept, budgeting is very similar in the sense that we've gone through and selected all of the different pieces we want. Now we need to build all of that information together. So our collect actuals is going to do exactly that. It's going to go out to the GL, pull all of that information together, and make it available for budgeting. The one thing to note with that is it's not a dynamic process in the sense that it's not automatically updating as more actuals come into the system. So if you ever wanted to say, oh, I've now moved forward a month and now have a new month's worth of actuals you want to bring into your budget process, you just need to recollect the actuals for that. And I'm just going to cancel instead of finish, but if we were doing this live, we would finish this process. What this would do for us is it creates our new budget line, and that's essentially the shell of our budget that we would use. Before I move on from the admin screen, I just wanted to touch on one other thing. Let's say we've now finished our 2017 budget, and we wanted to copy it forward or we wanted to make some changes. All of that is controlled by the Create New Budget toolbar item here. So Create Our Next Budget is simply going to advance the years forward for us. So to copy all the work we've done, just to advance the year forward. Create a Revision is just going to make a copy of it, and we could post that revision to a different budget ID. So you can say, here's my original budget, here's the revised budget, and report on those separately. Create New Budget is what we would have done the first time if we were starting from scratch. New Forecast will do exactly that. It's going to create a copy of the existing budget and allow you to make changes. Next Forecast just does the advance forward year. And the last option is a scenario. And the idea behind a scenario is it, again, is going to create a copy of the current year's budget and allows you to make some changes without that budget posting. We can ultimately decide that the scenario is what we want to roll forward with and actually post that budget. But it essentially just creates a copy, again, very similar to what Create Revision would do. So both of those are very similar in the sense how they work. Before I move on to the actual designer itself, any questions on the admin?
Chris, this is Bob Molesky. When you copy, when you get ready for a new budget, does it copy over the formulas but leave all the input that was manually input? Does that come through as blank?
Yep, everything comes through, and we've given you some tools to clear out that data.
Oh, okay.
So it will copy everything over exactly as it was for the prior year. Yeah.
And then there's a tool to get rid of everything other than the formula calculation?
Correct.
Okay.
There are, exactly. Yep. All right. So continuing on.
I just have one more.
Oh, sorry. Of course. Sure.
At the beginning, you showed the process of. Currently, we have to rebuild the queues because of the number of transactions we have going through our into our budget. Would we still have to rebuild a queue to get real-time information, or?
Yes and no. So the so we're talking about in Viewpoint Analytics now. You have to rebuild once you post your budget.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that process isn't going to change, only because the data is still coming out of budget and forecasting into the budget ID, and then those transactions have to come into Viewpoint. So if that transaction is still over the limit, which in your case might be 200,000 or 300,000 transactions, if it's over that, you're still going to have to rebuild. Yeah. So that process unfortunately won't change. There are some reports within the budget module itself that you could look at, but from the posting perspective, no, that's not going to change, unfortunately, if you're blowing that limit.
Let me ask a follow-up on that. It's Rich Oakley. You post your budget the first time with a huge amount of data, okay? And then you're tweaking it and you're changing it. So what happens right now with Adaptive is it constantly replaces
all of the data. Yeah, it's doing the same thing. It's not doing incremental changes. Yeah, it's doing the exact same thing. It's reposting all of the data. It's not just the incremental changes.
Okay, got it.
So if I could just add, Chris, can you confirm this? It's all real-time data within the budgeting module. So all the changes that you're making there, that's real-time. But then when you're transferring it over to your reporting over to Viewpoint, that needs to be refreshed, correct?
Correct. Like the actuals would not be real-time in the budget, because of course we're saying how many months worth of actuals do you have, and then there's a manual refresh process in that. So as an example, I'll just open this up now because I'll show it in a second.
Sure.
In our non-payroll expenses, so let me answer that question in just 1 second, Jonathan, actually, if you don't mind. Sorry, just bear with me for 1 second here. So this screen, I should just go back here for 1 second. Open this twice. This screen here is our budget designer screen. And the budget designer is where we're going to build all of our individual workbooks. And we're going to pick on right now our non-payroll expenses. So just to give a quick overview here, our top section here is looking at all of our expenses. The middle is our revenue. And the bottom is a couple different options for payroll. And we'll go through that in detail. We provide you different options because no two clients do payroll the same. And it's probably one of the more complex areas of the budget. So we're going to pick on our non-payroll expenses. And just to Jonathan's point, was this 2016 actual, this is the snapshot in time. So this is the actuals up until 6 months in 2016, because that's we said we had 6 months worth of data. And this is as up to date as it was when I said recollect my actuals. It's not dynamic in the sense that, oh, I just went and posted $10,000 worth of airfare. It's going to reflect that. You have to run the process to bring in those actuals. Now, typically that's not going to be a big deal because you're probably going to say when you're working through your budgeting, you want to say, this is based on my 6 months worth of actuals. You're not going to constantly change it. You're going to choose likely a point in time to say, we're going to cut this off and base everything off of whatever month we've completed. I'm assuming that that's a fair statement.
I would agree.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So in that sense, it's as you're kind of going through the setups, there might be some volatility to the numbers because, of course, you may not quite be to that point yet. But if you wanted to reflect the data, there would just be that manual refresh process. But once it's posted, absolutely. So the data is as up to date in Viewpoint Analytics as you've posted, refreshed, or rebuilt in that case. And of course, then there's a at least from the actual perspective on analytics, there's the cube refresh, which is running every minute or every couple of minutes. So it's as up to date as that process. If that helps clarify it, Jonathan. Yeah. Okay. So moving on, if there's no additional questions on prior piece, this is our budget data entry workbook. And within the data entry workbook, we break it out into a few different sections. On the left-hand side, we have our sheets, which are typically representing our business units. Again, we can actually mix and match the way we set this up depending on what the needs are, but generally we see it being sheets are representing units. On the main grid, we have our rows, which are representing our GL accounts. In our columns, we've kind of broken them down into two different sections. The first is going to be some attributes. So what's the spread method, which we'll talk about in a few minutes? What's the business unit ID and the account number? And then our additional columns get into what history do we want? So again, depending on the number of years worth of history we brought in, we can choose what columns we want to bring in here to represent that history. And then we actually have our data entry columns. And this is where we can get very customized depending on what your needs are. So we've called this our 3-column approach, where it's simply a preliminary column, which is typically driven somewhat off of formulas, some type of manual adjustments. So we can either do this at a total level or we can do it by period. And then our final budget, which is simply just taking a sum of the previous 2 columns. We've seen some clients use 3, we've seen some clients use 1, we've seen them use 5. It's really up to you as to what you want to see and what you need for data entry purposes. As we cycle through, you notice when we're going through each department, we have exactly the same listing of accounts. So it is very much a symmetrical view. Now, of course, you're going to run into saying, you know what, finance only uses 10 of these accounts, marketing uses a different 10. Well, the option we have for that is simply to suppress the zeros. So you will only see what you have activity for, would be the option to use there. From a data entry perspective, we have a couple of options, as you can imagine, because it's a demo database. I'm going to have to scroll through a department that hasn't been used too much here. Budget and planning, who needs to have that? Of course, our easiest option, as you can imagine, would be manual data entry. So last year I had 84,000. This year I'm going to have 90,000. The other options, of course, are to use formulas. So if I wanted to reference my prior year, we'll simply use our toolbar. And we'll say our equals GL. So all of our history always starts with these GL actuals or GL budget and allows us to reference the history. So here's my 1 year ago, and it can pull it in for us. Of course, if we wanted to say something like, you know what, I want to increase this by inflation, we can go, you know, times 2%. So there's our inflation factor. Now, of course, hard coding values in the database is not going to work very well for us because, of course, we need to remember to go update all of those. So the preferred option that we use is to use something called our variables. And our variables just a way that we can capture information we're going to use repeatedly throughout the process and only have to update that in one spot. So an example of that, I'll just pick one here, will be our inflation. So under our insurance general liability, we have said for this particular line item, I'm going to do the same thing we did before, take last year's actuals, but this time I'm going to multiply it by our budget.inflation. So instead of hard coding that 2%, we can just enter once what is the value for inflation in this case. And the way we've done that is we've created supporting workbooks. And in this case, it's going to be our corporate assumptions. And in our corporate assumptions, we can set up as many variables that are going to be used throughout the budget. And we have this idea of global variables that it doesn't matter what business unit they're being recorded for, it can be used anywhere. So what we're saying here is we just use our balance sheet unit as a placeholder. So we can really think of this as we don't care what unit has been used. We could use this 2.5% on any business unit. Same goes for our airfare and average hotel costs. The alternative would be something like our, if we wanted to put in headcount, or we wanted to put in, you know, square foot per department, or per diem rates that could be different by department, we can set up departmental assumptions, which do matter which business unit they're used for. So as an example, we'll see here that finance is 45, marketing is 50. It's all the same statistical count, just different values for each different department. So when we're going through the process and defining how we want to use this information, we simply say, is this going to be a global statistic or is this going to be a departmental statistic? And they're just set up a little bit differently accordingly. Our final data entry option is what we call a scratch pad. And the idea behind the scratch pad is we want to itemize something and provide more context than simply entering a number will do or using a formula. So what we can do is scratch pad it. So we simply right click on our column, or our row, pardon me, and we're going to choose scratch pads. And this template here is just our default template we give. This can be customized however you want. Add rows, add columns, add tabs. You can do whatever you want to this. The idea simply is we want to upload one number to the database. In this particular workbook, we're saying it's budgeted by totals. So we're just going to take one value and spread it across the periods. If we were budgeting by periods, instead of just having one value, we would have 12 values. So in this case, this is going to be providing itemization. So this is item 1. This is worth $1,000. Item 2 is worth $2,500. So we're essentially going to return $3,500 to the budget. So click OK. We can see here we now have $3,500 showing on that line. It's also now been noted as being scratch padded line. And as soon as we refresh this, we will also see that, as soon as it catches up here, there we go. We can see now that there's the edit button at the start of our line. So if we wanted to make any changes within our scratch pad, we would simply click on the edits and make those changes. So you know what, this should actually be 5,000. So 7,500 is our new number, and that's been updated there automatically. So scratch pads are a great way where you want to provide more detail than simply a number. Another option to provide more detail is if you do just enter a number, we of course can right click and put notes. So note is very similar to what you would have in Excel. Let me just expand this out here. Oh, if I can get a hold of my corner, there we go. So we can add in our notes here, whatever we need. Notes apply to specific cells. So this note is note 1. And you know what, we could do another one in our adjustment as an example. Move this out of the way. Do another note here. And that could be another note. We, of course, can turn those on and off. So they're simply just shown by the little red square in the corners there. The other option for providing information can be comments. And comments are a little bit different in the sense that notes apply to individual cells, where comments apply to an entire line item. So comments are more so used for describing why something was done or providing instructions, because both notes and comments carry forward. Another big thing to distinguish the two of them is notes can be removed. So if we right click on this, we could always remove this note. Comments cannot. Comments are permanent. So if we add a comment to this top line, say this is a comment for insurance. The way we see this is we have a couple panels on our right-hand side. So if we go to our cell info, and let's actually click on that line there just to show that. Cell info, we can see our comments listed here, but we also have a comments and questions tab. So let's just stick this out here so we can actually see this one. These are kind of all the comments that we've put in throughout the system or throughout this particular workbook. And the way it gets broken down is we see what is the business unit and then what is the line item. So the nice thing is right now we're on budget and planning. If we wanted to look at, we wanted to look at the comment that was on our bank service charges and finance, we can simply just double click on that. And it's going to bring us back to the specific line for the specific department and the specific line item. So as I said, this is more providing instruction or details as to why you did something. This is a way you can provide context to it. And notes are more of a, yeah, this is a sticky note for me to come back and do something with this. Comments cannot be removed. Notes can be. All right,
Chris,
so sure,
Chris,
go ahead.
On Scratchpad, can you pull in an existing? It looks like Scratchpad is an Excel type spreadsheet. Can you pull pull in an existing Excel file into Scratchpad?
You can. You absolutely can. And then all you're going to do there. So let's go back and just edit this for a moment. So from the Scratchpad menu, you could say Open, find your file. I don't happen to have one handy here. But then basically what you would do, whatever data loads in there, you would simply click on whatever cell you want to return for that line item. Okay. And then you would just identify the Scratchpad results. and it's going to return whatever that value is.
Excellent. Thank you.
No problem at all. Okay, so let's just go through the design of this a little bit, just to talk through how we actually put together this workbook. I'll collapse this over again so we got a little more space. There we go. So we won't go through everything because we'd definitely go over our hour if that was the case, but a few key things to note here. As I said, we can budget by totals or budget by periods, or we can do a combination of both. So the best of both world approach is saying, you know, maybe for our preliminary column, that's going to be budgeted by totals and simply spread, but then we want to make adjustments at the period level. That's been a very common approach for us. So something like that, we would just say, we're going to set this by periods instead of by totals. Of course, for anything that's flagged as totals, we need to say, how are we going to spread that information over the periods? So the out-of-the-box options you get are either even or average. So even, we have $12,000, we'll go $1,000 per period. Average would be used for something like, you know what, I have 15 people that work in my accounting department, I want to show 15 per period. The other options that we allow are you to do custom spreads. So as an example, we might say on payroll, I want to spread based on the number of days in a month or the number of pay periods per month. And the final option is a historical spread. So if we've said we're going to pull in 3 years worth of history, in order for us to spread and capture the seasonality of that, we could choose multiple years worth of history and simply have the information spread that way. So we've given a lot of different options for the spreading. And again, because of the customization we can do with that, there's almost nothing that we've run across so far we have not been able to do. Allow adjustments, I won't actually even touch on these. The only other thing that we'll touch on here is depending on which column your scratch pads are going to apply to, so they apply to a specific column. And depending on if that column is set up as by periods or by totals, we just need to match it up appropriately here. Going down to our lines, this is again where we go through and add in from our ownerships what dimension we want. In our case, we've used our units. So we simply add our sheets, pull from the dimensions. So this is a unit, choose the appropriate level within your ownership. So in this case, we pulled our hospital admin. And it's at this level here that I had mentioned earlier on the security side that we have a couple of security codes that are employed to lock down who has access to the designer, who has access to the administrative functions. But it's at this level here, the sheet level within a workbook, where you're going through and saying who is going to be responsible for doing the data entry on a workbook and who's responsible for approving the data entry on a workbook. That's what we said at the sheet level here. And so when a user logs in, as an example, if iMuggo2 logged in, all they're going to see is the finance department because that's all they have access to. The lines are very similar. Again, we just pulled from our ownerships. So we select our accounts and then what level within the ownership you want to pull. The nice thing about this screen here is we can do, we get very detailed as to how we're setting up each account. So as an example, we can say there are some default formulas we want to use. So as an example, if we said, you know what, the formula for workers' compensation, insurance workers' compensation is the same formula for every single department, well, we can set it in here, and this will apply to every department. So like we have up here for budgets, or for average airfare, average hotel, we've defaulted that in. So every department that uses airfare and hotel costs, that value will default there. So that's certainly one of the processes we go through to save a lot of time in the setups. The other thing we can do is we can change our spread methods. So as an example, if we said at the book level, we're going to spread evenly, we might have a department that actually spreads differently. So it might be, you know, an average here, but then we could say a particular line item might even be spread differently from that. So again, we allow you to set kind of tiered ways that these defaults are being applied. And just so I don't screw anything up in my demo for moving forward, I'm going to set that back. There we go. And the other thing we viewed here is, you know, we can hide lines if they're not applicable. So instead of going through and deleting certain things, if you just want to remove them so they just won't be entered, we can just manually hide them. Of course, if you did want to remove something permanently because it will never be budgeted, we can always just remove a line item individually.
And access is controlled, correct? You can control who can touch that page?
Yes. Yeah, so any of this function here, these are administrative functions. So this would only be people who are flagged as budget admins, which is controlled by those security codes I mentioned at the start. If you were just a data entry person, you wouldn't be able to click on that edit book design to even get in here. So the attributes are just additional information. So if you did change your spread methods on different line items, you'd probably want to see what that was. And then also just including the unit ID and the account value here. External variables are simply pulling information from another workbook. So as we talked about before, where we had that supporting workbook that held our inflation numbers, we would just need to come in and say, I want to reference that. So here's our inflation. We just want to say within this workbook, which is our non-payroll expenses, we want to make use of this, this, and this. And this just allows us to use it in this particular workbook. The last option we'll really talk about here is on our columns. And of course, our columns are representing either our history or our data entry columns. So as an example, let me just delete this one here. So right here, we're saying we have 1 year worth of history, our prior year, which is 2016, and our 3 columns for our budget. Very simply, if we wanted to add in 2015 actuals, we would just find that in our variable name here. So that's going to be our GL actuals 2 years ago, because again, everything is relative to the year we're budgeting for. So we're budgeting for 17, so 2 years ago would be 15. It's as simple as just highlighting it, going up to our add new column, add as display entry, and then we can just sequence our columns. So we'll save, refresh, give this one an update here, and we now have that extra year worth of history. So it's very simple to go through and add columns. You're simply selecting what do you want to represent, and it's typically, again, going to be one of our GL actuals, GL budgets, that type of information in our columns, and just choosing, is it a data entry column? Do I want it as just a placeholder? Is it kind of our final budget that's actually going to upload, or is it typically you display only for history? So pretty quick to go through that process. The last piece, again, is just retouching on what we talked about earlier with the analysts, that I said we could apply it globally in the configuration, or we could apply it at a workbook by workbook basis. So if we put somebody in here, they would only have access to this particular workbook in a view-only fashion. The upload we'll come back to in a bit, because it's a different workbook in a different example. Any questions on the designer before I move on? Sounds good. All right, so I will not save my changes. So I just wanted to introduce one new concept on the revenue side. And again, revenue is done differently. We're trying to give just fairly generic examples here, but show you some of the functionality that we would have. On the revenue side, in this hospital environment, it is driven almost exclusively off of statistics. So what we've done, you can see it here, we've set up a supporting workbook for our revenue statistics. So in our revenue workbook itself, which is just opened up here, we've picked on kind of 3 different departments. Intensive care coronary is one of them. Let me just reopen this workbook here. What we've done here is we've said, as we cycle through this, you can see it, this is built exclusively off of formulas. So we're going to take our last year's actuals and multiply that by some factor, in this case, we called it a multiplier. And it's really looking at the change in volume of statistics. So in this example, intensive care coronary is built off of, patient days, the number of patient days that we've had. So if we go back and look at our supporting workbook, what we've done here is we've pulled in 2 years worth of data and 2 years worth of statistics. We've said, what was my current year? So we'll go to our intensive care coronary. What was my current year statistic, which got pulled from actuals in the system? So a question to you guys, do you currently, number 1, use statistics in budgeting? And 2, do you record the actuals monthly in your system?
We budget off gallons and we record them monthly.
Okay. Oh, perfect. Okay, good. So that would be a statistic that you'd enter in the system. So in this example, what we're saying is we want to capture the change in volume. So last year we had 3,000 visits. This year we're expecting 3,500 visits. That's representing a rounded 17% increase in volume. Here, it was 250, 300, 20% increase in volume. So we want to use that change to drive our revenue. So of course, one thing we've seen is that could be our preliminary column. That's our starting point based strictly off the revenue. We can then do our manual adjustments for things you might know. We've seen other clients include, say this year we're having a price increase across the board. So we might have another column for price increases. And then ultimately our final column is just summing all of those up together. that's one simple approach we've taken for revenue, and one we've seen used quite frequently for those who have used statistics. Do you guys have a slightly different model? How would you drive your revenue calculations without going out into too much detail? Could you use this type of model, or would it be something different?
Ours would be a lot more complicated.
Sure.
We drive revenues off of volume times a budgeted gross profit margin, then add a budgeted standard cost of sale to then generate the revenue number.
Okay. So definitely some more pieces that we would need to enter in here. The nice thing is if we can get all of that information into Multiview somehow, that we could certainly use the calculations to come up with those numbers. So we just have to figure out what's the best way to get that information in the budget, and then just coming up with the formulas to make use of it.
Okay. Hey, not that you have to show it, but we're, kind of both, when we used to do an Excel upload and now we're doing adaptive, we kind of did everything by month.
Sure.
Cases, what we'd do is we'd put in the total and then, choose one of the adaptive spreads to spread it back. But in a lot of other cases, the month will be built off of a volume statistical number, or it'll be built off of percent of revenue for that particular type of, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
So I was just curious.
Yep. So as an example, we could change this. So these are all by totals. So just let me flip this, the adjustments, to be by period. Oh, I thought I changed that. There we go. So let me just flip this. So as an example, now that we've switched this to be budgeted by periods, hopefully this didn't break too much in my demo here. I'll just close this out here. 1 second. There we go. So as an example now, we're just looking at this at the total level. So this column here is simply spread everything using one of our spread methods. In this case, it was average. This one here was even. So we can now break this out to look at the periods. So in this case, I've just set up my adjustment column to be done by periods, but we could say, the total is done by periods as well, or the prelims done by periods, and allow you to make changes at a period by period level. We could do it either way. It's quite flexible on how you exactly would want to do that. And again, it's just whatever works best for you guys, whether it's you enter a total, have it spread, and then manually change it, or do you want to just change it in the adjustment column, or wherever you want to do that, we could do that.
Okay, so now you've got a 60 column display.
Exactly, and that's what we're seeing going across here. Yeah. And again, we can tweak things. So as an example, if in our book design here, when we go back down to our columns, it might be something where, I only want to see the history and the totals. So right now we're saying here, show this in totals, show this in periods. So it might be, I don't actually want to see my history in the period level. I only want to show it at the totals. So there's some ways to cut down on those columns as well, so we don't have 60 columns that we're having to scroll through. That's another option for us as well. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so I got to keep going because we're getting close on time, and I've still got some things to show you. The next piece I'd like to move on to is on the payroll side. And as I said, we give a couple of different options for payroll just because of the complexity. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the upload. And while we demo the upload use in payroll, it can really be used anywhere within the budget. And the idea behind it is we simply want to be able to take information that came from a spreadsheet, or could easily be exported into a spreadsheet, and tell Multiview how we want to read that information. So this is sometimes used for those complex models that don't necessarily fit into our data entry workbook, but we still want to have the ability to do it within Multiview. So really, you could create a very complex model within Excel, and we just want to upload a summary of that information. So you could have all kinds of supporting tabs and calculations and have a summary tab, which we simply upload into Multiview. And then when you drill into it, you could still see, okay, here's the summary, but it's built off of this tab and this tab and this tab. You can see the formulas. You can see all of that supporting information within the spreadsheet. So similar to what we did earlier, we of course can just go Scratchpad open and open an Excel sheet and load that directly in from here. So for our payroll example, we've kept this fairly simple. We said our business units are included in column A, and then we're going to upload 4 columns worth of information. So our annual wages, FICA costs, state unemployment, and profit sharing. The way we do this is in our edit book design, which is a button you'd get very used to pressing throughout this process. This is where we're going to use this upload tab. And very simply what we're doing here is just telling Multiview how we're going to read the information. So in this case, we're saying we add an upload area for each column in which we want to upload data. So our first column was column E. So the upload is just the sheet name in the document. So down in the corner is called upload. Column E was our first line of data. That's our salary information. Which row is it starting on? If you happen to know where it's ending, we can put that. Otherwise, we can leave it blank. Sometimes we might have keywords. So it might be, you know what, when you see the word total, stop reading. So as an example, if I had the word total over here, once it hit that, it would actually stop reading any further. The nice thing with that, of course, is you can have additional information down below here, and the system's not going to try to read that. Let's delete that so we don't cause any problems. First row would be that, so set that back to 0. The next thing is, depending on, again, it was mentioned that you might be uploading things, you might have detail by periods rather than by totals. So very similar, instead of having 1 column we're uploading, we would have 12 columns we're uploading. So again, we can do either a by period upload or a totals upload. And once we've defined where is the information coming from, we need to say, what is this information? So that's the bottom section. So we're going to say, where is my business unit coming from? In this case, it's coming from column A. And then what is my account number? So in this case, we've just hard-coded the value. We said, you know what, it's the 650005. But we could also say, you know what, it's this particular cell. So this would be column E, row 5. So we can hard-code it in that way. So instead of having to enter it, we can just reference the cell. So there's a few different ways that we can do that as well. And then we just repeat the process for each column. So column I gets the same thing. We go through to find where's our unit, where's our accounts coming from, and so on throughout the entire process. Additionally, I'll just mention one more thing to this. If we do budget down to the RAD level, this is actually just backwards on me, so let me do this. If we did budget to the RAD level, we can include RADs as well. So we can either say, actually missing a couple columns here, 1 second. There we go. So we could say, if this was RAD, we might say, you know what, this is the RAD type. So we could say, as an example, this is the event, and then put in a specific ID. Or we could say, you know what, this is the type, go to this column to find the different events. So as an example, we might say here, this is my event RAD type, events, I could learn to spell. And then just start entering, here's my 1, 2, 3 event, my whatever event, and it can pull the information out of there. Or we could hard code it like we've done in here. It's, again, quite flexible there. So that's the process. It's pretty straightforward as far as defining how Multiview is going to read the information. And that's really all this is used for, is just to set up the definition and understand what Multiview is looking at, and then what specific data is going to be uploaded to the system. And we've seen this used in payroll because people can often have a payroll model already built in Excel, or they can very easily export payroll information out of a payroll system. But I've also seen it used on a fairly complex revenue model where we just couldn't quite get it done in our regular data entry workbook in an efficient way. So we just took the result of the information from an Excel sheet and uploaded it that way. So it's kind of our, I guess the way to think about it is it's really our kind of catch-all approach. If we can't do something using one of our other models, we always have the upload option. The next option for payroll, or we used for payroll, is the payroll specific workbook. And what this allows us to do, and this is actually similar to what at least one other client that's moved from Adaptive was using for payroll. So I'm not sure if you guys use Adaptive's payroll as well.
Yes, we do.
So this might look perfect. So this will look quite similar then. The idea behind this one simply is we are using payroll records. So in our case, we've budgeted down to the individual level. So each individual is a payroll record. And a payroll record is simply made up of up to 20 user-defined fields we provide you to enter whatever level of detail you need for budget purposes. So as an example, for our demo purposes, we wanted our pay rates, pay type, employee type. So are they yearly full part or yearly versus hourly? Are they full-time versus part-time? Job classifications, kind of home department, 401k eligible, percentages, benefits packages, and up to 20 other ones. And within here, it's simply giving the information that we're going to use within formulas to drive our calculations. The other piece that's neat with this is we can do an allocation of the budget costs, or the payroll costs. So if you had an employee that was split across departments, you could easily allocate those dollars in here. Additionally, the advantage of using this model is we can use dates to drive our calculations. So let's say you had, for example, a contractor that was working 6 months of the year. They had what would be an annual salary of $100,000. Well, if we only had them working 6 months, that's going to be $50,000 worth of salary. The system will prorate that based on their start and end dates. The additional piece we can do is raise dates. So clients or employees might get raises based on their anniversary of their start date. We can put that in, and it's going to trigger the increase on that date, or it might be and across the board, everybody July 1st gets an increase. So it can be set up to use those dates to drive the calculations. The big piece that comes into play here is in our book design. And within the book design, we go through here and say our columns are set up a little differently than what we've seen before. So our columns in this case actually represent our GL accounts, which we're uploading to. So we have our office salaries, profit sharing, health insurance, Social Security, and unemployment. Each column is simply representing a GL account. And the way we drive our calculations are we create lookup tables that we need to populate with our formulas. So for each one of these columns, we have a lookup table. So we have one for salary, profit, health insurance, and so on. So to actually take a quick look at those, we'll edit our lookup tables in the toolbar. And one of the easiest ones we'll start with is just our health insurance. Simply what this is doing is it's just evaluating the conditions we've set up to pull information based on the attributes on each person or payroll record. So we're going to say, depending on if that person is couple, family, or single, we're going to say for benefit purposes, we're going to allocate $110, $175, or $95 per period for them. If we look at, say, profit sharing goes a little bit more granular. So it's looking at the payroll record again. So if this person's yearly full-time in Executive 1 job classification, this formula is basically saying take 5% of their salary for the year and divide it by 12 to get the per period amount. The last one I just wanted to show on here quickly is the Social Security. So this is really just we use an RC notation and simply a row column notation when we're referencing our columns here. But this is 6.2% of their salary, basically. But we're also introducing the cap. So we can put the cap amounts directly in here as well. And it's as simple as that. So for each column that we want, we would just go through and set up the appropriate formula to reference that information to drive those calculations. So for payroll purposes, the majority, the payroll purposes, the majority of the calculations, or for what we've seen so far, everything is driven off of calculations. There's virtually no manual data entry that's required on this one. Sorry, was there a question?
Yeah, on the, for example, state taxes, how do you guys handle changes, maximums and rates, and is that a
you can control that? Yeah, so what you can do there is, what we can do here, let me just go back into the book design for a second. So it changes year over year in rates?
Yeah.
Is it? Okay. So what we could do here, when we're going through and setting up our lookup tables, so instead of going through and hard coding, here is 6%, for example, or for Social Security, here's 6.2%, we could actually set this up as a variable. So we can have one of those supporting workbooks that have all of your different rates. So instead of having to come in here and update everything, we're just going to have one place for you to change it all. Yeah.
That would refer back to that table and that assumption.
It does. Yeah, so this, instead of it being 6.2, it'd be budget dot state and employment tax or whatever it happens to be. we could do it that way. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Okay.
Yep.
Continue. I've answered my own question while I was talking to you. Okay.
Okay. Well, these are great questions. Thank you so much for asking. So really, that's kind of the way this comes together. So in the end, there's really no data entry that we've seen being done on the payroll workbook. It's all driven off of calculations that you built. There's just two little pieces I wanted to talk about to wrap up here, since we're getting really close on time, and I don't want to keep you guys any longer than we've scheduled. What we can do once all the information has been collected in these different workbooks, we want to be able to get a snapshot as to where we stand within the budget. So what we do for that is we can create a budget workbook. So the workbook is actually set up very similar to, say, our non-payroll expenses or revenue and how we build it, but it's just a view only. So it's collecting all the information from all of the different workbooks and making it available to us. So we can look at it at a consolidated view. We can look at it by department. We can start grouping it down like we would in Excel here with our line groupings. It's just a quick way for us to get an overview as to where we stand. Not too sure what happened to my history here, but I have to take a look at that, I guess. The idea behind this would be something like, you know what, for outpatient service revenue, let's say I had $50 million, but I've only budgeted $37 million. I've probably missed something in my budget. So you need to do some investigation on that. It's really just to use that kind of spot check. You would never use this as an actual reporting tool. It's just a quick way to look at the data. Additional options. Sorry, go ahead.
Could you replicate a Viewpoint P&L report in this budget report?
You can to a point. The formatting functionality is limited within here. Okay. And that's why we suggest that you can publish or you can post the budget and then use the data in Viewpoint Analytics. If you want to get more of the kind of reporting capability, it's limited in the way you can format in here. So you can't really see percentages. The variance is going to look a little funky. There's going to be a few thin limitations to that because it's really not used for that. That's what analytics is for.
And is this real time?
This would be real time in the sense of the budget. So anything that's been entered in any budget workbook will be shown real time in here.
Okay.
Yeah. The last kind of reporting piece I wanted to show was how you can view the spread information. So if, as an example, you were to come in and say, oh, for some reason, you know what, this number looks like it's doubled up. How would I ever find that? What you can do is view the budget spread. And you can do this on a workbook by workbook basis, or you can do it from where I did, looking at the budget as a whole. And this is simply just leveraging our pivot charts. So we can go through and say, okay, for, you know what, let me find consulting fees. 20, bad example. Here we go. Number of deliveries for OBGYN. So if I wanted to say, well, you know, that seems to look a little high. I wonder where that's coming from. We can simply double click on this to drill into the data. And that's going to show us exactly where it came from. So it came from our revenue statistics workbook from this department. If we wanted to drill further, we could simply view the book, and it's going to launch us right back to that originating workbook. This would be the same process if we were drilling from Viewpoint Analytics. It would bring us through exactly the same steps, right from the analytics side. And we can see exactly where this came from. You know what, it was OBGYN deliveries, and that was the per period amount from this 310. And truly the last thing I wanted to show was a way to get an overview of where the budget stands at any one time. So don't judge our data entry process here as to how far behind we are on our budget entry. But when we see all the red here, it's going to be a little disturbing. This simply is showing from kind of the center, and let me zoom in here, the center of our budget. So this target in the center is our start of the budget. And then this initial grouping, this first circle around, are all of our different workbooks. And then each section off of this is just the summaries of each of those. So as an example, if we look at revenue, we'll say, here's our revenue workbook. Here's the revenue department, which was the top level. Here's a summary level. And here's a posting level. It's kind of the lowest level where we'd actually do our data entry. We might be like, wait a second, I'm sure that one's already done. Let's double click on it to take a look. So you can simply double click. It's going to bring us into the revenue intensive care coronary line within our budget. So intensive care coronary, and we can see it's right to where it is. So let's assume this was just a, oh, you know what, this was done. They just forgot to flag it as completed. So we'll mark it as completed. close our designer, and when we refresh this, of course, it's going to jump back to the main grid there. But if we zoom in here, we'll see that's now gone. So it's a quick way just to get an overview of where everything stands from a data entry perspective, and allows you to drill right into it directly from here as well. So that's about all I wanted to show you for today. I know we're a few minutes over, so thank you for sticking it out. Are there additional questions that you might have, or any other examples we might be able to provide?
Chris, this is Bob again. I'm sorry to
Not at all. Not at all, Bob.
When you add, if during your the budget process you add a new unit, like if we have a new acquisition, or very infrequently a new account,
Sure.
Once you put all that information into Multiview in terms of the non-budget, does it automatically flow over, or?
It doesn't. Right now, we're actually working on that. That's a priority for Brian. That's kind of our top priority now on managing ownership changes. So right now, it's a manual process. So we would simply go into a workbook, kind of drag and drop it to where you want it to go.
Okay.
But that's Brian's top priority right now to fix that.
Okay. And really, have any of your users noticed any performance issues once you start this process?
From a performance standpoint, the only issue we really ever run into is if we try to put too much in one workbook. So as an example, if we said, we're going to put every single account in one workbook, we'd probably run into issues because that's a lot of data in one workbook. From a volume of data, so here's an X number of years worth of history, no problem. If we got into so many lines, we would run into issues, and that's why we've simply broken things up, typically into expenses, revenue, and payroll separately.
And my last question is, do you have to be on version 16, or if for example, we're on 15.1, would everything you talked about today be available in 15.1 for us?
It would. So there's a patch available in 15.1, I think like 15.1.12 or 15.1.13 that would have the latest information. Because 16.1 is now out, I would probably suggest going to 16.1 and taking advantage of that functionality. But okay. The short answer to your question is no, you could start it on 15.1.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You're very welcome. Any other questions? Doug, any questions from you?
Oh, we're good here, sir.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your day, guys. And if there are any other questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm sure Jonathan will follow up with you anyways. Jonathan, any follow-ups? Yep.
No, if there is anything that we haven't covered, I can follow up and then we can kind of just go from there. I know there's follow-up questions related to using multiple variables as formulas, and then questions with regards to how you can transfer that data since you're coming from adaptive, or how long it might possibly take to set up those stat accounts if they're not in Multiview yet. So we can look at the options of bringing that data in as a historical or stat accounts, or the Excel upload feature that Chris mentioned. So it's really if that information is readily available to bring into Multiview, basically, to get you started in this. But if you see all the workbooks that we've set up in the Multiview via this diagram, is that kind of how you budget right now in terms of setting up different workbooks for different types of account numbers? And
no, we do it basically by unit, and the person responsible is budgets every line item in that unit.
Okay. So it's by, okay, I see what you mean. Is that possible in Multiview, Chris? Would that be too much line items?
So as an example, how many accounts would be in a workbook? Like, are you setting up, that's a scary question because I know you guys have been around for a while, but would that be
1,000 accounts?
Ooh, okay. That would probably not work that well. That's a lot of accounts.
Not all of
how many
you.
different, right, that's true. I think we'd have to see it to see kind of what your current setup is.
Chris, is probably to get probably to get you guys and Rich and myself together and to look at it in detail, because we have obviously some very unique issues and
Sure.
that we certainly would love to be able to move on to into Multiview and keep it in one place.
For sure. Yep.
All of our issues are covered, and the training isn't too much of a spike in getting our people ready, because obviously
Sure.
we believe that we have an 18-month window to. We're really ideally looking at 2020 as opposed to 2019.
Okay, sure.
It'll take that long to move our people up to speed.
Yeah, sorry, Bob. We don't want to take too much of your time, but I can have an internal discussion with Chris. And
absolutely.
Folks, what we can do.
Yep.
And then we can get back to you. I think there's some strategies that we can use there to make sure that.
I know it's early yet, but at iMug, are you going to be devoting much time to budgeting?
As far as development work?
Yep. Going forward, I know it's early yet, but are you envisioning having classes on budgeting or talking with other users that are on it now and stuff like that?
As far as making enhancements to the product as we move forward?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I think the short answer to that is yes. and we learn frequently from what our clients want, right? Of course, we built a tool that was a generic tool and has been enhanced quite a bit since 15.0 with what our clients need. So it's really the feedback that we get from you guys that helps us drive this product forward. So I think the easy way to say this is, if you guys do have a very complex model, there's a lot that you can provide to us that will help us improve the product.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think meeting probably be very helpful for both parties.
Sure.
Because I said, sure. we really do want to use the product if we possibly can.
Yep. No, for sure.
Okay.
All right. Well, we'll let Jonathan set that up.
Yeah. So I'll just add one more thing. So for iMug, we always have 3 to 4 sessions, and we can always do a roundtable. So we present to you all the budget configuration and kind of a roundtable. I know from last year there was at least 3 or 4. So that, depending on the demand and what people are requesting, we could probably increase that if there's more attendance this year. And then as far as what's going to be developed Q1, Q2 before iMug 2018 is the web forms, so that the data entry can be done on a web form, as far as to my knowledge. And then what Chris also mentioned is that that update on your ownership so that it's transferring over to BNF. So those are the kind of the 2 that is going to be enhanced before iMug. And then based on feedback that we get from there, or just working with our clients now, we're then able to make more enhancements and features to the product.
Good. You might want to touch base with Dave. He might give you a little bit of history of he's very familiar with our requirements in terms of how we're set up and everything. Dave Nordquist.
Sounds good. I'll touch base with him. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
I'll get back to you as soon as I can.
Thank you. Have a great day. Take care, guys.
Thanks, Chris.
Bye.